The old man did not answer. He looked worn rather than offended, as if the storm had followed him inside and refused to let go. The siren climbed, then stretched long and aching, the medevac call threading through the building like a nerve being pulled tight. Bodies stiffened. Radios snapped awake with fragments of coordinates and clipped voices. I felt the night pitch forward, the way a loose container tips before it crashes. If you believe that real honor rarely announces itself, stay with me here, and remember who taught you that lesson. Captain Daniel Kerr told himself this was about discipline, not pride. On nights like this, when the wind seemed determined to peel the skin from the bay and the radios hiccuped under pressure, the base felt thin along its borders. Thin borders invited trouble. Trouble invited attention. Attention invited headlines. Command had been explicit in the last briefing. No surprises. No breaches. No stories about unauthorized bodies wandering into restricted operational spaces while the public was already anxious about storms, outages, and infrastructure failures. He had endured too many stolen valor briefings to dismiss a stranger wrapped in an old jacket. The images returned uninvited. Men in mismatched fatigues bought secondhand, fake medals pinned crooked, smiling families who had believed every word. His jaw always tightened before the instructor even finished the slides. It was never just fraud, it was disrespect. Like spray paint dragged across headstones. Sewn when the old man stepped in from the rain, water dripping onto the vestibule tiles. Something inside Daniel locked into place. The man moved with an ease that irritated him, as though checkpoints were formalities meant for other people. There was no nervous search for identification, no hesitation about where to register, just a steady, unbroken line toward the desk, like someone who had spent a lifetime walking onto bases and expecting doors to open. Daniel cut across the lobby without consciously deciding to. The gunnery sergeant at the booth looked up, then deliberately away. Good deference to rank. Daniel adjusted his poncho, squared his shoulders, and let his voice settle into that narrow band of authority that left no room for negotiation. He asked the required questions. Name, invitation, Samuel Harker. The old man said, as if the name should carry weight. His voice did not tremble. It also did not challenge. It was simply a fact placed on the counter between them. The name triggered nothing. It was not on the short list of visiting dignitaries or retired flag officers Daniel had reviewed earlier. It was not a gold-trimmed name that made operations officers smile. That alone dropped the man into a lower category. Unknown, unverified. And your paperwork, sir, Daniel said. Storm lockdown is in effect. Restricted movement? You understand that? I do, the man replied. Smooth, professional. Daniel heard the edge under his own words and allowed it to remain. Edges kept systems sharp. The old man glanced toward the lobby windows where rain blurred the world into a shifting gray sheet. His eyes passed over the digital status board, the silhouettes of cranes, the faint outlines of ships riding the chop. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached into his jacket pocket. No hurry at all. That bothered Daniel more than visible nerves would have. A small crowd had formed. Dress uniforms, evening clothes, work coveralls, people sheltering from the wind, drawn in by the quiet promise of conflict. They watched with the polite curiosity that always found friction entertaining. Daniel felt them like an audience gathered for an unscheduled inspection. As the man moved, Daniel caught sight of the jacket sleeve. First, just worn leather, spotted with rain. Then the patch resolved. Not a unit he recognized. Not post, division, or fleet. A coiled shaped elan or wing. Its threads faded almost to the color of the leather beneath. He dismissed it instantly. The market was flooded with novelty patches, and half the stolen valor cases involved stitched legends ordered online. Nice souvenir, Daniel said lightly, filing it away as another mark against. If it had been real, he told himself, he would have seen it somewhere official. Movement behind the man drew his eye. Communications specialist Alina Rios crossed the vestibule without breaking stride. She headed straight for the flickering routing panel where signal paths crawled like veins across a map. Her tablet was already awake, stylus moving as nodes shifted from green to amber. Daniel registered her and mentally shelved her support. Infrastructure, necessary, but not decisive. Whatever she was logging would flow downstream to someone else. He turned back to Harker. The identification appeared, but it was incomplete. An outdated access card, a dog-eared letter bearing a command signature that was authentic, but old-creased enough to have browned at the folds. The kind of thing a sentimental veteran might carry to stay close to a life that once defined him. Storm lockdown requires current authorization, Daniel said, louder now. He felt the crowd lean in, not hostile, interested. This is a restricted operational environment tonight, not a reunion. We don't wave people through because they have stories about the past. The old man did not react. His eyes were pale and weathered, like objects left too long in the sun. He listened. No apology, no defiance. That unsettled Daniel more than anger would have. His radio crackled half a sentence about outer pier sensors dropping, then static. He adjusted the knob with irritation. Maintenance had promised upgrades for months. Instead, they were riding out a storm on systems older than some of the lieutenants. Over Harker's shoulder, Daniel saw Alina again. She was circling clusters of failing icons, linking them with quick strokes, head tilted as if listening to something no one else could hear. For a moment he considered asking what she was seeing. Then he remembered priorities. A possible breach at the door outweighed a technician tracking routine failures. He hardened his posture, shoulders back, chin level. His voice took on the formal rigidity drilled into him at every enforcement brief. You are not on the list, Mr. Harker. This is not open access. Veterans don't walk into restricted ops because they tell stories. The sentence landed exactly as intended. Someone behind them inhaled sharply. The gunnery sergeant shifted his stance. Good. Let them feel it. Standards mattered most when they felt uncomfortable. Beneath the regulations and controlled irritation, something else stirred. He remembered his first command as a brand new lieutenant, watching a senior officer dismantled behind closed doors after a security lapse. The words had never faded. You do not get to be careless at the door. He pictured the after-action report if this man turned out to be another fraud with a camera or worse. Someone with intent and a concealed weapon. The base was already exposed to the storm. It did not need exposure to humiliation. He decided then that he would not simply send the man back into the rain. He would escort him off base himself. Cameras would record everything. There would be no doubt about how firmly and correctly the situation had been handled. Gunnery Sergeant, Daniel said without breaking eye contact. Hold the inner gate. I'll walk our guests to the outer checkpoint once we confirm there's no current authorization. The old man met his gaze with the same tired, unbroken calm. For a brief moment, Daniel wondered what it would take to fracture it. Years of discipline, he guessed. Or stories that could never be told. He pushed the thought aside and reached for his radio. Procedure first, doubt later. That was how order survived when everything beyond the glass dissolved into chaos. The first time the storm struck the cables, Alina felt it before she saw it. A deep shudder traveled up through the concrete, rippling the coffee in her paper cup and rattling pens in their tray. A heartbeat later, the routing board flickered 3 green nodes bleeding to amber with reluctant grace. She set the cup down untouched, wiped her hands on her sleeve, and leaned closer to the display. The air in operations tasted like dust and ozone, the way old servers smelled when pushed beyond design limits. Voices around her grew louder, sharper. She filtered them out. Noise fixed nothing. Proceed did. She tapped the first failing link. Diagnostics bloomed. Packet loss climbing. Signal strength dipping in time with the gusts hammering the water. She checked the redundant route and confirmed what she already suspected: it was carrying more load than it had ever been meant to hold. Someone higher in the chain had pushed infrastructure upgrades down the calendar again, choosing budget cycles and committee comfort over resilience. Storms never waited on paperwork. Alina adjusted the gain margins, nudged emergency traffic to the front of the line, and logged the change in her tight, disciplined handwriting. Date, time, cause, effect. Every entry was a message to people who would never stand in this room or smell overheated circuitry. Mixed with damp concrete. She did not rush. But she did not waste motion either. Each movement was measured, purposeful, unrepeatable, quiet, deliberate, relentless. That was how systems survived when weather tried to kill them. On her wrist, the watch ticked steadily against her skin. The crystal was scratched, the band worn thin near the buckle, thin enough that she checked it twice a week. Her father had worn it in Iraq, where sand found its way into everything, and time bent strangely around explosions and long waits. He had once told her, in a voice he reserved for truths that mattered, that you didn't need to shout to hold a line. You just had to refuse to step back. She shifted her attention to the secondary board where external feeds mapped the base into narrow lines and blinking nodes. Outer pier sensors flashed, erratic, then stabilized. Harbor radar stuttered. Then the communications panel spit out a short error burst and encrypted handshake. Request from an address block she hadn't seen in years. It flickered, attempted authentication, then vanished before the sequence could complete. Alina froze, not from fear, but curiosity. Outdated protocols didn't usually wake themselves during storms. She pulled the log, tagged the anomaly, and scribbled a note in the margin. Legacy key signature, unknown user. She did not trigger an alarm. Alarms were for confirmed threats, not for ghosts wandering through circuitry. Voices rose near the entrance, just past the inner boundary where operations ended and the lobby began. She recognized the captain's tone before she parsed the words. Tight official, calibrated for an audience. The voice of someone asserting control. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the small ring forming around the checkpoint. The old man stood at its center like a stone in fast water, rain flowing around him without altering his shape. His jacket was darkened by the storm, shoulders loose, hands visible. He didn't argue. His eyes moved once across the lobby and paused on the wall map showing vessel positions and pier assignments. The pause was brief, but it wasn't the look of a visitor admiring a display. It was the look of someone inventorying assets. Her attention slipped to his sleeve. The patch caught the thin light fighting its way inside. Coiled lines, a shape like a talon or wing. The threads had faded into the leather, nearly invisible, unless you knew how to look. She didn't recognize the unit, but the wear bothered her. Souvenirs frayed at the edges. This one had been rubbed smooth, like it had been touched in quiet moments. Remembering names not carved into any wall. Ma'am, outer pier nodes just dropped again. A young specialist called from the secondary console. His voice cracked at the end. Medevac approach is requesting updated wind shear data. They're not getting stable reads. Alina turned back to her panels. The failing links resembled teeth knocked loose in a row. She rerouted traffic away from the worst interference, forced low-priority packets into queue, and opened a fresh channel to the weather station feed. The system pushed back with a brief red warning bar, then complied. Lock in the last clean data set for medevac, she said, nodding to the specialist. Flag any variance outside tolerance. Route it to my screen before it goes to the bridge. Her voice stayed even. The specialist's shoulders lowered a fraction. Calm meant someone believed the floor would hold. The encrypted handshake appeared again on her auxiliary displayer. Thin request line pulsing softly, hesitant, like a knuckle tapping once on a door. She isolated it, pulled up archived access profiles on a separate monitor. There it was. An old clearance tied to a classified project name she couldn't fully see, the letters ending abruptly in black bars. The last recorded activity predated some of the sailors sleeping in the barracks. Sometimes the loudest part of a mission is what nobody hears yet. The thought surfaced fully formed. She wrote it down before it could fade. Ideas were easier to trust when they lived on paper. She wondered who or what was still knocking with keys that should have been melted down years ago, but the medevac feed stuttered again, and priorities weren't philosophical. Lives depended on altitude and wind, not puzzles that could wait. She flagged the anomaly, assigned it a neutral code, unknown, unresolved. In the lobby, Captain Kerr's words cut through the equipment hum. The sentence about veterans and stories carried thin and sharp into the bay. A few heads turned. Alina kept hers forward. She'd learned early that drama at the door had a way of stealing attention from things actively trying to kill people. Still, her eyes betrayed her for a heartbeat. The old man's gaze had shifted from the map to the real-time status board. His eyes tracked cranes and ships with a familiarity that didn't belong to a first-time visitor. He followed the pier indicators in the same sequence she checked during her own routines. It was nothing, really. Most people saw lights. He seemed to see a pulse. She turned away and opened the trunked channel list. Most encrypted lines held steady on modern protocols. One lingered half-lit like a hallway running on emergency power. Its identifier matched the legacy key that had brushed her system moments earlier. With an old clearance or someone pretending to be was testing the base architecture. She considered walking over to the captain, telling him there was something he needed to see, not about jackets or paperwork, but about how the systems reacted when that man arrived. But procedures weren't built on instinct. They were built on logs, patterns, proof, so she documented everything. Time of appearance, time of fade, route attempted, key length, hash fragments that aligned with entries buried deep in legacy databases. She flagged it for secure export at a higher classification, knowing someone with broader clearance would read between the lines. A supervisor stepped in behind her, rein clinging to his shoulders. Rios, how bad is it? His breathing suggested more than just the walk from the outer door. Manageable if we keep the load balanced, she said. Medevac and convoy channels, stay clean. Everything else will crawl. Command wants no surprises, he reminded her. They're on edge about the storm and pier conditions. She almost told him about the legacy key, about the feeling that something old had knocked through a cable instead of a gate. Instead, she said, understood, and trimmed static off another channel like a surgeon removing dead tissue. In her peripheral vision, she saw the old man again, closer to the inner line now. The captain rigid beside him. The jacket looked heavier not from rain, but from memory. His eyes swept the displays with the ease of someone who had done this too many times to count. He didn't look impressed. He looked like someone checking on a grown child, raised by different hands. Alina pressed her thumb against the cool metal of her watch, grounding herself in its steady tick. Her job wasn't to decode the past or judge who belonged where. Her job was to keep signals moving between people who needed each other in the dark. If there was a story folded into that jacket and that forgotten patch, it would surface where it belonged. In secure rooms, in files thick with black bars, in the eyes of people who remembered. For now, she listened to the storm batter the walls, watched channels strain and recover, and kept her notes exact. Somewhere nearby, a voice rose. Somewhere over the water, a medevac pilot waited on numbers that meant survival. And somewhere just beyond her clearance, an old access key had stirred like it had been waiting for its owner to step back into range of a base that had almost forgotten his name. When the storm tore open another seam in the clouds, the medevac board flared a harsher blue. I stood beneath it, headset crooked, listening to the pilot breathe between words. Wind shear, crosswinds, microbursts, stacking like bad rumors. I'd flown enough to know you don't fight weather like that. You respect it or it breaks you. Hold pattern 3, I said, marking the time. We'll feed you the next data window. What steadied me wasn't my own voice. It was the silence on the other end. Trust the belief that the numbers would come. That someone down here had the ground under control. I looked across the room and found Alina Rios, working the way she always did, shoulders loose, eyes ahead of her hands. Calm, not because she didn't care, because she cared in the right direction. Most people remembered last spring's blackout as the night the pier lights went dark. I remembered it as the night she rebuilt the routing table by hand, when the software refused to cooperate. We pulled 3 wounded Marines off a barge because she would not accept the phrase system limitation. Since then, whenever a storm rolled in, I watched her. Tonight, the tension climbed like the tide. You could feel it stretch between consoles. Voices grew clipped. Jokes evaporated. Everyone started checking the same readouts twice, then a third time, just to be sure. The rain hammered the far doors hard enough to sound like someone trying to get inside. My gut tightened the way it does before a pilot makes a bad call. Not because something had failed yet, but because everything might. Out by the inner checkpoint, it was happening again. Captain Kerr had squared off with the old man in the soaked leather jacket. I couldn't hear every word, but tone travels. The captain's voice had that brittle edge, like glass pretending it was steel. The old man stood there with his hands open, letting himself be dressed down in front of half the lobby. I hated it, not loudly, just in the quiet way you hate watching rank get used where empathy would have worked better. The Corps teaches chain of command for a reason, and I believe in it. But I've also seen real heroes say sir to a private on a stretcher. There was something in the old man's eyes that didn't match the script. He wasn't cowed. He looked tired. Alina noticed too. I knew it by the way her gaze skimmed the scene and then moved on, not dismissing it, just prioritizing. She reached under the console, traced a cable, found a kink, and eased it straight like she was calming a vein. A subtle receipt. A quick No announcement. The board wavered, then steadied. Channel 4 is yours, she said. Barely above conversational volume. No one questioned it. The bridge acknowledged. The pilot exhaled into my ear, and the room's temperature dropped a degree. There are people who control by volume, and there are people who build trust like scaffolding. She was the second kind. Another gust rattled the frame. An indicator blinked, then stayed dark. I watched her lean in, lips pressed together, and thought. She didn't rush. She isolated the fault, slid a patch cable across a gap, and nodded once, like the circuit had agreed with her logic. The screen rippled, then the feed returned cleaner than before. Behind me, someone muttered about the captain making an example. The words tasted wrong, even as a whisper. We didn't need examples. We needed solutions. Kerr pointed at the jacket, said something sharp enough to make 2 Marines shift their stance like they wished they weren't present. The old man just blinked, like he'd endured louder storms, harder men, and longer years. Wind shear? Update inbound, Alina said to the room. She didn't ask permission. She spoke the way gravity does unavoidable. Trust it. The specialist beside her snapped into motion, typing faster. Data spilled across my display. I relayed it to the pilot. Copy, he said. Steadier now. As I lifted one side of my headset, I caught Elena's eye. She didn't smile. Didn't acknowledge it at all. She just moved to the next line, as if saving lives was another entry that had to be precise. That's when I realized my shoulders had relaxed. Not because the storm had passed, but because she hadn't. Kerr kept pressing. The word stories surfaced again. I turned away not because it wasn't my business, but because the medevac was. Still, the scene stuck with me. Respect is a muscle. If you don't use it, it migrates and turns into something meaner. A minute later, the room fell into a hush as another surge hit the grid. Elena's voice cut through it cleanly, switching auxiliary to analog backup. Keep priority lanes open. Cables moved in her hands like they belonged there. No one argued, no one second-guessed. We all went back to work, because when the weather gets loud, the only thing that matters is the people who know how to keep signals alive and the rest of us staying out of their way. The lights didn't flicker. They died a hard, absolute cut, like someone had pinched the world's throat closed. For a breathless second, the operations bay held still in the dark. Then the emergency strip snapped on, bathing everything in a dull red that turned faces into silhouettes. The silence that followed was worse than noise. My headset went dead. The medevac pilot's breathing vanished mid. The boards lost their glow. Even the server hum disappeared, replaced by rain-beating metal somewhere far away. Out on the pier, a klaxon tried to rise and choked halfway through. Alina was already moving. Not fast, never frantic. Just that steady momentum that said she'd rehearsed this disaster 100 times in her head. She dropped to one knee, flipped a mechanical bypass on the power conditioner. Nothing. She hit the second. Still nothing. The supervisor muttered. Grid's gone. Generators didn't catch. Manual mode, Alina said, mostly to herself. Her hands found the old panel maintenance had promised for years to replace. It took a key in both palms to rotate the selector into a position most of us had never used. The panel clicked, like a lock opening somewhere unseen. The radios came back not clean, not digital, but raw analog. Static flooded the room like surf. She leaned in, adjusted the gain, and began carving voices out of the noise. Medevac. This is Port Ops, she said, calm enough to steady everyone who heard it. Say position, if able. A fragment bled through. A coordinate, then static again. The supervisor looked up, as if command might descend through the ceiling. Automation's down. Crane control offline. Floodgates aren't responding. Beyond the lobby glass, pier lights that had survived the earlier waves blinked out one by one. At the far end, a convoy, 4 trucks, an ambulance, and a maintenance tow set frozen as water crept up their tires like something alive. Captain Kerr turned in a tight circle, as if the problem would reveal itself if he faced the right direction. He yanked his radio down, listened to nothing, switched channels, switched back, then stared at it like it had betrayed him. Establish command net, he barked. We need accountability. We need. His voice failed when no one answered. Protocol lived in him like scripture. Without the next line, he had nowhere to stand. Alina didn't ask permission. She unplugged 3 network trunks at once and snapped in a bundle of dust-coated patch lines that hadn't been touched in years. She tested each one like checking pulses. Green filaments winked alive. She nodded once. Routing medevac through analog 9, she said. Keep it narrow. Don't chase the noise. The corpsman swallowed. Copy. She turned to the convoy feed, now blank rectangles. Switch telemetry to manual input. We'll rebuild it by hand. Someone laughed, short and nervous, then stopped when they saw her face. Numbers began arriving from the weather station. She wrote them down immediately, translating data into tolerances and thresholds with the certainty of someone who learned math by touching consequences. The old man, Samuel Harker, hadn't moved far when the power failed. While others backed away from the glass, he leaned forward, like he was listening to something through it. Under the red emergency lights, the lines in his face deepened. For a moment, he looked younger. Not younger, the way coastlines do when the tide pulls back and exposes the rock beneath. He glanced at the wall map, then the overhead cable runs. Then the emergency panel Alina had opened. Those conduits, he said softly, almost as an aside, used to bridge to a secondary breaker behind the east storage bay. Alina heard him because she was listening to everything. She didn't look up right away. She traced the path in her mind, paneled a conduit to the place he'd named. The official blueprints didn't show a breaker there, but manuals only got updated for things people were allowed to talk about. She turned her head as he drew a breath that sounded like memory. 19 years ago, after the storm that cracked the lower pier, a classified retrofit. It wasn't supposed to exist. Captain Kerr stiffened, recovering enough to recognize a threat, even when it arrived disguised as a sentence. Sir, this is an active operation, he said tightly. Please do not speculate about infrastructure you are not cleared to discuss. Harker didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on the conduit, fixed with the intensity of someone staring down a debt. It'll take 3 minutes to spin up, he said. If it still lives. Alina studied him then, really studied him, the way you reassess a piece of evidence after realizing you've been holding it wrong. Her gaze flicked back to the encrypted channel logs on her side screen, to the legacy key that had brushed their systems the moment the storm forced everyone inside. Gunny, she said quietly to the gunnery sergeant near the door. Take someone you trust. Check behind the east storage bay. Look for a sealed panel at waist height. If it's there, call me before you touch it. Kerr snapped toward her. That area is secured. So is this. She replied evenly, gesturing at the dead automation. And we're still standing in the dark. The gunnery sergeant didn't salute. He nodded once and vanished into the storm with 2 Marines, their ponchos snapping like wings before the lobby swallowed them. Alina turned back to the board, keeping the manual channels alive. She rewrote the priority ladder so the medevac sat at the absolute top, shoving background traffic into a deep queue. Her headset pressed into the bone behind her ears. Medevac, this is Ops, she said. Read me partials if that's all you've got. 2 miles drift, the pilot answered, voice crushed by static, holding altitude by instinct. Trust the numbers, she said softly, more for him than herself. We'll give them back to you. Out on the pier, the trucks tried to reposition. Water surged, retreated, then returned higher. One driver gunned the engine too hard and spun into spray. Alina inhaled slowly and forced herself to choose the next right action, not all of them at once. Behind her, Harker stepped closer to the inner line. No one stopped him. There are moments when uniforms matter less than gravity, and this was one of them. He spoke quietly, almost apologetic. Those old lines weren't built to talk, he said. They were built to listen when the newer ones failed. She didn't ask how he knew. She wrote instead. Old bones, listen, not talk. Then she rerouted the last surviving harbor sensor through an auxiliary diagnostic port, a trick she had never been officially taught, something she discovered by accident years ago. A warped, low-resolution image flickered onto the screen, ugly, lagging, alive. The corpsman stared at it like she'd summoned it through prayer. I've got wind shear, he said. Feed it, Alina replied. Kerr moved toward the window. His shoulders were hunched now, less commander than man, watching the storm like it might negotiate if stared down hard enough. He looked at Harker with resentment that wasn't entirely new. Who are you? He asked, too quietly for anyone else to hear. Harker's mouth twitched, not with pride, not with humor, but with something like regret. Wrong question, son. The inner door hissed open. The gunnery sergeant returned, soaked through. Urgency clutched to him like gear. Ma'am, he said to Alina, not the captain. It's there. Panels painted over, sealed, but intact. Open it slowly, Alina said. There should be a wind-up wheel. Tell me what you see. 10 seconds stretched into something that felt like 100. Wheels here, the sergeant said. Secondary breaker behind it. Looks old. Engage at half, she instructed. Count to 15. Then Fulty obeyed without asking which manual had taught her that sequence. Probably because he understood what we all did. We were past the part where manuals saved people. The emergency lights dimmed for a breath, as if the bass inhaled deeply. Then a bass note rolled through the floor. Not the clean whine of new generators. Something deeper, older, reluctant, but awake. Consoles blinked. Lit settled into patient standby. Partial automation crept back like a hand finding a wrist in the dark. Floodgates answered not all of them, but enough. Sensors rejoined in jagged clusters. Kerr turned relief, washing his face into something almost boyish. Good work, he said to the room. To no one in particular. Alina didn't stop. She stitched the revived systems carefully into the manual skeleton, refusing to overload either. The medevac pilot's voice sharpened. Convoy engines found traction as water pulled away from the pier like a retreating argument. She finally looked at Harker. Not as a problem, not even as an unknown. You didn't guess, she said quietly. You remembered. He met her eyes without flinching. Places change. Foundations don't. From the corner of her vision, she saw Kerr open his mouth, then close it. For the first time all evening, he seemed unsure what needed correcting. On her screen, the legacy key blinked once more, then settled. With the old breaker humming, the handshake made sense. The system had recognized something it had been built to recognize. He hadn't trespassed. He had returned. History had walked back in from the rain wearing a jacket no one knew how to salute yet, and the bass deep in its bones had risen quietly to meet him. The blast doors at the end of the corridor slammed once, hard enough to shake dust free. Then they parted. The Naval Operations Commander entered with 2 aides and the Sergeant Major at his shoulder. No speeches, no thunder, just motion with intent. He scanned the room the way surgeons scan a patient, looking for what was dying and what could still be saved. Status, he said. The supervisor started to answer, but Alina was closer. Partial automation restored, sir. Manual channels stable. Medevac holding pattern 3. Pier flow slowed. Not safe yet. The commander nodded once, as if confirming something he already knew. His eyes moved past her to the old man standing just inside the line. For a moment, nothing changed. Then he blinked just a hitch, like memory brushing up from deep water. He turned to his aide. Pull everything on Samuel Harker. Priority clearance. The aide hesitated. Sir, that name triggers an interlock. Do it, the commander said softly. The classified console emitted its low tone, the one that always made rooms feel smaller. The screen filled with black bars, paragraphs swallowed whole. Only 3 lines remained visible, like bones left after a storm. Codename: Ghost, Talon Roll, Lead Architect and Field Commander. Operation: Deniable Maritime Sabotage. Retired. Record sealed. The air shifted. No gasps, no words, just a current passing through the room. Someone stepped out of Harker's way without realizing they had moved. The commander approached. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand proof. He stopped in front of Samuel Harker and raised his hand in a precise, deliberate salute held longer than regulation required. Sir, he said quietly, it's an honor. Harker returned the nod without embarrassment or satisfaction, simply acknowledging a language they both understood. The commander turned to face the room, his voice steady and unadorned. For those who do not know, he said, some men build foundations you never see. Tonight, one of those foundations kept this base from breaking. Remember that? Captain Kerr stood several paces back, the red emergency wash coloring him in a shade that felt uncomfortably close to shame. The cadence of rules, protocols, and security briefings echoed in his thoughts. With nowhere to retreat, he looked at the jacket, the patch, the tired eyes, and understood painfully that he had spent the last 20 minutes guarding a gate against one of the men who had helped design the gate itself. He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to explain. The words never formed. He lowered his eyes instead. The commander shifted his attention to Alina, studying the web of cables, the handwritten notes, the revived consoles stitched by hand in 2 manual lines. Warrant Officer Rios, he said, we have partial communications because you refused to wait for the system to behave. Keep doing that. Respect did not arrive as applause. It arrived as posture. People straightened when they looked at her. The coxswain gave a small nod he didn't seem to realize he'd made. Even the technicians, sleeves rolled and grease on their wrists, found themselves standing a little easier, because she remained calm at the center of the storm. The commander allowed the moment to settle, then said simply, finish the job, and stepped aside not to yield authority, but to give space to competence. In the quiet that followed, Kerr finally understood what the night had revealed. The uniform did not always mark the highest ground. Sometimes history moved in silence, and sometimes leadership sounded like a steady voice, keeping failing wires alive while others searched for a manual that no longer applied. The medevac emerged from the clouds like darkness, turning toward daylight. For a heartbeat, it was only a deeper shadow fighting the rain, rotors cutting arcs through the mist. Then Elena's numbers aligned. The pilot eased the nose down, and the skids touched the pad so lightly the entire room exhaled at once. "Touchdown." The coxswain said softly. Alina logged the landing, timestamp precise, and shifted her attention to telemetry. Partial automation and her manual lattice worked together now on easy, but effective. Floodwaters that had risen like a challenge began to drain through the gates. She had coaxed awake. The first truck reversed cautiously, tires finding purchase where there had been none. The ambulance lurched, then straightened. The tow vehicle pulled with patient insistence. She watched the convoy inch away from the edge that had been trying to erase them. When the last vehicle cleared the danger zone, a weakened section of pier finally surrendered, sliding into the water with a sound that made the room flinch. Foam rushed to fill the space where men had stood moments before. "Convoy clear," Alina said. No triumph, just fact. Beyond the windows, the storm's voice began to change. Less rage, more exhaustion. Lightning retreated offshore. Sodium lights glowed against a sky relearning how to be gray instead of black. Movement returned to the room without orders. Marines stepped aside as pier crews entered, soaked and blinking. No announcement, no command, just an unspoken widening of space that formed a quiet corridor. Those who passed through did not cheer. They carried wet gear, fatigue, and relief. Some touched shoulders, some met eyes and nodded. A few glanced toward Alina, then looked away, as if naming what she had done might disturb it. Captain Kerr stood at the edge of that corridor, posture perfect and somehow smaller. When the old man entered the line, Kerr stepped aside, not theatrically, but because it felt impossible not to. Samuel Harker moved as though the storm had taken something he'd been prepared to give. Ordinary light softened the maps behind him. No one blocked his path. The sergeant major inclined his head, a wordless exchange between equals. Alina did not rise. She didn't need to. Her world remained cables, waveforms, and systems remembering how to live. She tracked medevac lift, confirmed fuel transfer, verified clean handoff. The final channel pulsed, so she stayed with it. Minutes stretched. The storm pressed once more against the glass, testing, then released its grip. The medevac lifted, rotor wash scattering puddles into silver arcs. It banked toward the city, a dark cross against the first pale seam of clearing sky. Only when the confirmation chimed, patient stable, convoy accounted for, pier secured it. Alina released the transmit key. She closed the final channel with the same care she had opened the first and leaned back, not collapsing, simply allowing gravity to remember her. Harker watched from a respectful distance, as if stepping closer might interrupt a ceremony he understood too well. Their eyes met. No music, no spectacle, just recognition between two people who had held a line together without speaking it aloud. A faint crease formed at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile so much as a memory of one. It lingered, softening the years. Alina returned the smallest nod, then looked back to her notebook and wrote the final entry of the night in the same precise hand as the first dot outside. The storm finally broke itself apart, leaving the harbor slick and shining, rearranged just enough that those who had been there would never mistake it for an ordinary night again.